I went into a pawn shop for a watch band. I walked out staring at my own wife's engagement ring behind the glass. She told me it was lost. The shop owner told me who really sold it, and why. That's when I understood exactly what 12 years of marriage had actually been worth. My name is Jorge Muller. I'm 41 years old, a structural engineer by trade, the kind of man who spends his days making sure bridges don't fall and buildings don't crack under pressure they were never designed to hold. Chicago has been my home for the last 15 years, though I grew up 2 hours south, in a small house where my father taught me that silence could be stronger than shouting. I never understood that lesson fully until the night my marriage ended in our kitchen, under a light that had started to flicker weeks earlier and that neither of us had bothered to fix. Nora and I had been married 12 years by then. We met at a mutual friend's wedding, both of us slightly drunk on champagne and the idea that we'd found something rare. For a long time, I believed we had. But the last 3 years had been different. My mother's illness drained our savings and my patience, and I threw myself into overtime shifts at the firm, telling myself I was protecting our future while slowly losing the present. That night, I came home smelling of rain and rebar, my boots leaving wet prints across the hardwood. Nora was sitting at the table, a glass of wine untouched in front of her, her phone turned face down like she'd been rehearsing something and didn't want to be interrupted mid-thought. She looked up at me and said the words plainly, like she'd practiced them in the mirror. Our marriage was over. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why, though the question sat heavy in my chest. Something in her voice told me this wasn't a door swinging open. It was one that had already been closed for a while, and she was only now telling me the lock had changed. I set my keys on the counter, looked at her for a moment longer than I meant to, and walked upstairs without a single word. Behind me, I heard her chair scrape against the floor, like she hadn't expected silence to be my answer. I packed one bag that night, not because I'd planned it, but because 12 years of marriage apparently fit into a duffel if you're honest about what's actually yours. Shirts, a razor, the watch my father left me. Nora stood in the doorway of our bedroom watching me fold clothes I'd worn 100 times, and I could tell my quiet was unsettling her more than any fight would have. "You're not even going to ask me why," she said. I zipped the bag. I stopped asking why a long time ago, Nora. I just didn't say it out loud. Her face did something complicated then, not relief, not sadness, something closer to confusion, like she'd rehearsed this scene with a different ending in mind. Maybe she wanted me to beg. Maybe she wanted proof that the last decade had mattered enough to fight for. I couldn't give her that, not because it didn't matter, but because I'd been quietly grieving this marriage for longer than she knew. I drove to my brother Tomas's place in Evanston with the windows cracked, cold air cutting through the car, my hands steady on the wheel in a way that surprised me. I kept waiting for the grief to hit. Instead, I felt something closer to exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones after holding a weight for too long. My phone buzzed somewhere around Howard Street. I almost ignored it, assuming it was Nora. It wasn't. An unknown number, no name attached, just 7 words that would unravel everything I thought I understood about the last few months. "She's not who you think she is." I stared at the screen at a red light until the car behind me honked. I didn't respond to the message. I didn't need to, not yet. Some part of me, the part that calculates load-bearing weight and stress fractures for a living, already understood that something in my marriage had been quietly failing long before tonight, and I simply hadn't looked closely enough to see the cracks forming. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and kept driving, the city lights blurring past like something I was already leaving behind. Tomas opened the door before I even knocked, like he'd been expecting me for weeks rather than minutes. He didn't ask questions. He just pulled 2 glasses from the cabinet and poured whiskey without measuring, the way our father used to when something needed saying but not yet. "She's leaving me," I said, sitting down at his kitchen island. "I know," he said, and something in his tone made me look up. "You know." He didn't answer right away. He turned the glass in his hand, watching the whiskey catch the light from the range hood above the stove. "I've seen her, Jorge. Downtown, at that wine bar on Wells. More than once. Always with the same guy." I felt something drop in my chest, slow and heavy, like watching a support beam give way in stages instead of all at once. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't know what I was looking at," he said. "And because I didn't want to be the reason your marriage ended, even if it wasn't really me." I thought about the unknown text message still sitting unanswered on my phone. I thought about the late nights Nora had explained away as work dinners and girls' nights. I never questioned because I trusted her, because 12 years should count for something. "What does he look like?" I asked. Tomas hesitated. "Older than you'd expect. Kind of a musician type." I only caught his name once. Callum, I think. The name meant nothing to me then. It would mean everything soon enough. I finished the whiskey in one motion, the burn giving me something to feel besides the strange, hollow calm that had followed me since the kitchen table, since Nora's rehearsed words, since the door closing behind me for what I now understood might be the last time. Tomas refilled my glass without asking. Outside, the city hummed along, indifferent to the quiet collapse happening inside two people who used to build a life together. The name Callum surfaced something in my memory I hadn't touched in years, a story Nora told me early in our relationship, back when we still stayed up until 3 a.m. trading histories like currency, trying to prove we were worth investing in. She'd been 22, a senior at DePaul, dating a musician who played bars on Lincoln Avenue and talked about Nashville the way other people talk about heaven. Nora loved him the reckless way you love someone before you understand what love costs. Then the record deal came through, and he left within a month, barely a goodbye, just a note and a cassette tape of songs he said were about her. She told me she cried for a year. She told me she swore she'd never again build her life around someone who saw her as a chapter instead of the whole book. I remembered holding her that night, promising I wasn't going anywhere, meaning it completely. I didn't know then that the promise would outlast the feeling behind it, worn down slowly by mortgages and medical bills and the particular exhaustion of two people trying to hold a marriage together with less and less time to actually be married. What I didn't know, what Tomas's information was only beginning to reveal, was that Callum hadn't stayed in Nashville. The label dropped him 2 years ago, quietly, the way labels drop most people. He'd moved back to Chicago 6 months earlier, broke, humbled, freshly signed to a small local label hungry for a comeback story with an emotional hook. A man doesn't return to a city empty-handed. He returns looking for something to rebuild himself around. And Nora, unknowingly or not, still had unfinished business written all over her. The same wound her father tore open when she was 9, the same fear of being left that made her chase stability so hard she nearly forgot to ask if it was actually happiness. I didn't know all of this yet. I only knew a name, a bar, and a feeling that the ground beneath my marriage had been shifting for longer than I'd allowed myself to notice. I told myself I wasn't going to the bar to spy. I told myself a lot of things that night that turned out not to be true. Wells Street was quiet, rain slicking the pavement into a mirror of neon signs and passing headlights. I parked across the street from the wine bar Tomas mentioned, engine off, breath fogging the windshield. I almost drove away twice. The third time, I saw her. Nora, laughing, really laughing, the kind I hadn't heard from her in over a year, at a small table near the window. Across from her sat a man I recognized instantly, though we'd never met. Something about the way he leaned back in his chair, guitar-calloused hands wrapped around a glass of wine, confirmed everything Tomas had only gestured at. Callum. I watched her reach across the table and touch his arm, brief, familiar, the kind of touch that belongs to people who've stopped pretending distance matters. I didn't go inside. I didn't call her name. I lifted my phone and took a photograph through the rain-streaked glass, her face and his blurred together in a way that felt, somehow, appropriate. Then I drove away, the city lights smearing past the windows like something already dissolving. My phone rang an hour later. Nora's name lit up the screen, and for one unreasonable second, I thought she might be calling to explain, to confess, to give me something honest to hold on to. Instead, her voice came through tight and worried, asking if I'd seen her engagement ring anywhere. She said she couldn't find it. She said she'd looked everywhere. I told her I hadn't seen it. That much, at least, was true. But sitting in my brother's driveway with rain drumming on the roof of my car, staring at a photograph of my wife's hand on another man's arm. I understood that the ring was the least of what had gone missing between us, and that whatever she was hiding about it would matter far more than either of us was ready to admit. What Nora never told me, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that the ring hadn't been lost at all. 3 weeks before that phone call, she'd walked into a pawn shop on Milwaukee Avenue and slid it across the counter herself. Callum needed money for studio time, a small sum by most standards, but enough to matter to a man rebuilding a career from nothing. She told herself it was a loan between old friends, something temporary, something she'd quietly replace before anyone noticed. She didn't let herself examine why she was the one making that sacrifice. She didn't let herself ask why a 12-year marriage suddenly felt less urgent to protect than a man who'd already left her once. I imagine her some nights, sitting in our old apartment, turning her bare finger over under the kitchen light, telling herself the story she needed to survive the guilt. That it was generosity, not betrayal. That old friends help each other. That Jorge would understand if it ever came up, which it wouldn't, because why would it? When I offered to help her search for the ring that night on the phone, my voice steady, genuinely willing to spend hours retracing her steps, something in her went quiet on the other end of the line. I didn't understand the silence then. I understand it now. It was the sound of guilt meeting kindness it didn't feel it deserved. "You don't have to do that," she said finally. "I want to," I told her. "It's important to you." She didn't answer right away, and when she did, her voice had changed, softer, almost apologetic in a way that didn't match a simple lost ring. "Thank you, Jorge. Really." I hung up feeling, for the first time since the kitchen table, a flicker of the old tenderness between us. I didn't yet know it was the last uncomplicated moment we'd share, that somewhere beneath her gratitude sat a truth about to surface, one that would rearrange everything I thought I understood about the last month of my marriage. 2 days later, I stopped into the pawn shop on Milwaukee Avenue for something unrelated entirely, a watch band, nothing more. I wasn't looking for anything. That's usually how the worst discoveries happen. The ring sat in the glass display case like it belonged there, like it hadn't spent 12 years on my wife's hand through every argument and anniversary and quiet Sunday morning we'd built a life around. I recognized the setting immediately, the small chip in the band where she'd caught it on a car door 3 years back, a flaw only someone who'd held that hand every night would notice. I stood frozen, staring through the glass the way I'd stared through the rain-streaked bar window days earlier. The shop owner, an older man with reading glasses pushed up into thinning hair, followed my gaze. "You've got a good eye. Nice piece." Woman who brought it in seemed in a hurry, said she needed to help someone out, didn't want to talk much about it. I didn't correct him. I didn't explain that the woman he was describing was my wife, or that the person she needed to help was very likely the man I'd watched her laugh with through a rain-blurred window. Something strange happened in my chest then, not the sharp stab of anger I expected, but something quieter, colder, more like recognition settling into place. All the late nights. The distance that crept in gradually enough that I'd mistaken it for exhaustion. The rehearsed way she'd said our marriage was over, like she'd practiced the words in private long before she ever said them to me. The marriage hadn't ended in our kitchen. It had ended months earlier, in small decisions I hadn't been present for, in a version of Nora that existed somewhere I no longer had access to. I bought the ring back without telling the owner why. I didn't do it out of sentiment. I did it because I needed to close something properly, the way you seal off a structure before you walk away from it for good. I found out later, through Tomas, who heard it through a mutual friend still connected to the local music scene, that Callum's label had a plan for his comeback story. Young, hungry, unattached, a narrative Nora didn't fit into once the label started shaping his image for release. He ended things with her the same way he had a decade earlier. Without warning, without much explanation, a man following opportunity wherever it led him, indifferent to what he left behind. I wasn't there for that conversation, obviously. But I've thought about it enough times to imagine it clearly. Nora sitting in that same booth by the window, the one where I'd watched her laugh through rain-streaked glass, now sitting across from an empty chair and a glass of wine going warm and untouched. I think about her that night more than I probably should, given everything. I think about the moment it must have landed on her, the realization that she'd dismantled a 12-year marriage for a man who'd once again proven he saw her as a chapter, not a life. What she probably didn't examine, not fully, was where that fear started. Her father left when she was 9, walked out on a Tuesday and never fully came back into focus after that, not even during holidays, not even at her wedding, where his chair sat empty the way it always had. Callum's return hadn't just offered her romance. It had offered her a chance to rewrite an old ending, to be chosen this time instead of left. Instead, she got left twice by the same man, and lost a marriage in the process that had, whatever its flaws, never once threatened to walk out that particular door. I don't know if she cried that night. I don't know if she called anyone. I only know that somewhere in that same city, while she sat with the wreckage of a choice she couldn't undo, I was 3 miles away, quietly beginning to understand that I might finally be free. The divorce paperwork moved faster than either of us expected. No shouting matches, no drawn-out custody battles over furniture or friends. Just 2 people signing documents in a lawyer's office with afternoon light slanting through half-closed blinds, motes of dust drifting between us like the last visible pieces of 12 years dissolving in real time. Nora looked smaller across that table than I remembered her. Not physically, something else, something harder to name. I didn't feel triumphant watching her sign. I didn't feel much of anything except a strange, settled clarity, the kind you get after finally identifying the source of a structural failure you'd been troubleshooting for months. I gave her the ring back before we finished. I didn't explain where I'd found it, and she didn't ask, though something in her eyes told me she suspected. I wasn't returning it out of tenderness. I was closing an account, literally and otherwise, the way you tie off loose wiring before walking away from a job. What I hadn't told anyone yet, not even Tomas, was that I'd already accepted a position with a firm in Denver 2 weeks before Nora sat me down at that kitchen table. I'd been quietly considering it for over a year, ever since my mother passed and Chicago started feeling less like home and more like the site of a slow collapse I'd been too tired to prevent. Maybe some part of me had already been leaving before she said the words out loud. Maybe that's exactly why I could stand up from that kitchen table and walk upstairs without an argument. Because some structural part of me had already accepted the load was more than the foundation could bear. I signed my name below hers, closed the folder, and shook the lawyer's hand. Outside, Chicago looked the same as it always had, indifferent to the quiet demolition that had just been finalized inside that office. Denver was waiting. I didn't look back on my way out the door. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment in Denver, the mountains a dark silhouette against a sky just beginning to surrender its light. The job was good. The city was unfamiliar in a way that felt more like possibility than loss. I'd started running again, something I hadn't done since my 20s, and most mornings I woke up without immediately reaching for the weight I used to carry before I even opened my eyes. My phone buzzed on the counter behind me. I almost let it go, the way I'd let so many things go that year. But something made me check it. Nora's name. Can we just talk sometime? I think about you more than I probably should. I read it twice, standing there with the wind picking up off the Rockies, cooling the back of my neck. I thought about the kitchen table, the rehearsed words, the rain-streaked window, the ring sitting in a display case like evidence of something neither of us wanted to examine too closely. I thought about Callum, about her father, about the particular ache of being left twice by the same man, and how that ache must have made my silence feel, in hindsight, like something she hadn't known to value until it was gone. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty. I'd stopped needing to punish her somewhere around scene 7, if I'm honest. I simply didn't have anything left to offer that conversation. Some doors close quietly, and the quiet itself is the point. I set the phone face down on the counter, the same gesture Nora had made months earlier at our kitchen table, though neither of us could have known then how the story would eventually fold back on itself. There's a particular kind of loss that doesn't announce itself with shouting. It arrives in silence, and it's the silence that stays with a person longest. Nora wasn't finished trying. But that's a story for another time. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories.